This is the first lecture in a 25 video course on the historical reliability of the Gospels. In this video, we will consider who wrote the second Gospel. For most of church history, it was assumed that a person named Mark was the author, specifically John Mark, who was the travel companion of Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey. Yet this assumption has been seriously challenged by critical scholars over the last century or so. And now many are claiming that we have no idea at all who really wrote it. Now, perhaps you or someone you know has called into question the traditional authorship of the Gospels. Bart Ehrman, for example, a professor of religion at UNC Chapel Hill and prominent skeptic, he writes this: all of the Gospels were originally anonymous and then later connected with the names of the apostles and apostolic companions. He goes on to say, as the books were copied and circulated, names were still not attached to them. As a result, the identities of the authors were soon lost. Then later readers, rightly or wrongly, associated the books with two of the disciples, Matthew and John, and with two companions of the apostles, Mark, the companion of Peter, and Luke, the companion of Paul. Now notice Ehrman's claim here. The Gospels were originally anonymous, no titles and no authors. Now, to be sure, the Gospels are formally anonymous. There's no named author in the body of the text. But that's also true of many other literary works as well, other than, say, like letters, where the sender would typically put their name in the body of the text. Now, why is this an important issue? After all, there's other biblical texts like Ruth or Judges or Samuel and Kings that are anonymous. That doesn't necessarily undermine their reliability. However, if the traditional authorship is correct, it would certainly enhance the Gospel's credibility. Because what it means is that the information goes back to people who were really there, people who walked and talked with Jesus. And as far as ancient historiography goes, this is as good as it gets. As the Scandinavian scholar Samuel Bierskog remarks, autopsy, meaning to see for one's self, was the essential means of reaching back into the past. And so over the next 4 videos, we're going to consider the authorship question surrounding the 4 canonical Gospels. This video, though, is just going to focus on the Gospel of Mark and its authorship. Now, traditionally, when trying to discern who the author of these texts were, scholars have tended to look at 2 different types of evidence: external evidence and internal evidence. External evidence refers to the writings of the early church. The internal evidence refers to information inside the books themselves. In other words, what kind of clues does the book itself give us about its authorship? And we're going to consider both of these types of evidence in turn. With respect to the external evidence, the earliest surviving reference that we have comes from a person named Papias, who was the bishop of Hierapolis, which is now modern-day Turkey. Now, Hierapolis was located near the ancient cities, or towns, I guess I should say, of Colossae and Laodicea. Hierapolis was also the home of Philip's 4 prophetess daughters that are mentioned in Acts chapter 21. In fact, Papias tells us that Philip's daughters used to tell him many stories about the apostles. Now, Papias wrote a 5-volume work that's titled The Exposition of the Sayings of the Lord, around the year 125 or so. But sadly, almost all of his writing is lost. Only a couple dozen fragments of his work survive in the writings of other writers. Now, one such quote that has survived is found in Eusebius, a 4th century church historian. And this quote by Papias is especially relevant considering the authorship of the second gospel. He writes, "This also the elder said. Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not indeed in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adopted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses, so that Mark committed no error, while he thus wrote some things as he remembered them. For he was careful of one thing, not to omit any of the things which he had heard, and not to state any of them falsely." Now notice a few key points here from this quote. Number one, Papias claims that the Gospel of Mark was based on Peter's eyewitness accounts. That is to say, Peter was Mark's primary source for this gospel. This doesn't mean he didn't use any other sources. It just means that Peter was his main source, especially for Jesus' Galilean ministry, since Mark himself lived in Jerusalem. Number two, Mark himself was not an original disciple of Jesus. As Papias says, he neither heard the Lord nor followed him. Now, I don't think that means Mark never saw Jesus or heard him speak. I think it just means that he wasn't one of Jesus' regular followers or disciples. Number three, Mark wrote accurately, but not in chronological order. Here, I think Papias is tipping us off to his preferred gospel, and that is the Gospel of John. In fact, it's John's gospel that gives us the clearest chronology of Jesus' ministry. With the many times that Jesus is traveling back and forth between Judea and Galilee, we learn from John that Jesus' ministry lasted roughly 3 years. Mark's gospel, on the other hand, could give the impression that Jesus' ministry only lasted 1 year because it only has one visit of Jesus to Jerusalem for one Passover, and that was the final week of his life. And number four, Mark received this information from the elder. As we'll see in the video on the authorship of John, I think it's probable that the elder is the Apostle John himself, which might explain his preference for John's order. What this also indicates is that even though Papias is writing here around the year 125 or so, he's reflecting back on a previous time, several decades earlier, when he had interactions with John himself. And so what Papias appears to be reflecting on here is a time back in the 80s or the 90s. And so what we're getting here really is a very early tradition regarding Mark's authorship. Now, the next writer to refer to gospel authorship is Justin Martyr, sometime around the year 160. In his dialogue, Justin claims that the memoirs, right, this is a term he often employs for the Gospels. He says these memoirs were drawn up by the apostles and those that followed them. Now, in all likelihood, Justin is referring to the 4 canonical Gospels here. The ones drawn up by the apostles, those are Matthew and John, and the ones that are drawn up by those who followed them are Mark and Luke. It's clear from this quote that Justin knows at least 2 Gospels written by apostles and 2 written by people who followed apostles. Of course, John and Matthew are the apostles, Luke and Mark, those who followed the apostles. A similar idea is conveyed in a quotation by the church father Tertullian about 50 years later or so. He writes, "Of the apostles, John and Matthew first instill faith into us, whilst of apostolic men, Luke and Mark renew it afterwards." So John and Matthew, apostles, Luke and Mark, apostolic men. The next church father to consider here is Irenaeus. Irenaeus was the bishop of Lyon, and he was someone who sat under the teachings of Polycarp, who was the bishop of Smyrna. Now, Polycarp is significant because he himself was a disciple of the Apostle John. So, in a way, Irenaeus is sort of like a spiritual grandson to the Apostle John. Also significant is that Irenaeus spent a significant amount of time at the Church of Rome, which happened to have a substantial library of biblical and apocryphal texts. And we know this based upon the writings of Clement, who wrote near the end of the 1st century, as well as Justin Martyr, writing in the middle of the 2nd century. Thus, Irenaeus is in a very strong position to know about the authorship to the Gospels. Now, with respect to Mark, Irenaeus writes this: "After Peter and Paul's departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter." Here, Irenaeus agrees with Papias' earlier remark that Mark is the interpreter of Peter, writing down the accounts of Jesus based upon what Peter had told him and what Peter had been preaching. I also want you to notice that Irenaeus doesn't appear to be defending his claims that Mark is the author. He doesn't seem to be trying to make a case for it. He's just simply stating a well-known fact, that Mark stands behind the second gospel. Now, here's another quote from Clement of Alexandria, roughly about the same time, just a little bit after Irenaeus. He says, "The gospel according to Mark had this occasion. As Peter had preached the word publicly at Rome and declared the gospel by the Spirit, many who were present requested that Mark, who had followed him for a long time and remembered his sayings, should write them out. And having composed the gospel, he gave it to those who had requested it." Again, we find the common theme that Mark is really Peter's account. But we do have a bit of a discrepancy on the dating of the gospel. If you recall, Irenaeus said that Mark wrote after Peter had died. Clement here is saying that he wrote it while Peter was still preaching, still alive in Rome. Now, tradition has it that Peter was crucified under Nero around the year 65. So if Irenaeus is correct, that would date the gospel in the late 60s, perhaps the early 70s. However, if Clement is correct, the gospel should be dated to the early 60s, or perhaps even the 50s. It should also be noted that the church father Jerome reports that Mark wrote the gospel while Peter was still alive in Rome. And Jerome, interestingly, claims that he received this information from Papias, the writer who was writing early in the 2nd century. That's a very early tradition. Now, sadly, that portion of Papias's writings is now lost to us, so we can't confirm it. Now, the differences in the dates don't make a ton of difference. What matters the most is that there is universal consensus in the early church that Mark penned the second gospel based upon Peter's eyewitness testimony, his autopsy. And when I say universal consensus, I really mean universal consensus. There's not one single competing tradition in the writings of the early church, and I could have listed more. So in summary, every bit of external evidence from the early church supports the view that Mark wrote the second gospel based on Peter's eyewitness accounts. No competing traditions exist. However, many scholars tend to dismiss all of this external evidence or simply explain it away. Bart Ehrman, for instance, thinks that we shouldn't believe these early writers because they had ulterior motives for making up these names. Here's what he says. Eventually, it came to be seen as necessary to assign authors' names to the four Gospels that were being most widely used in the Orthodox circles, to differentiate them from the false Gospels used by the heretics. In other words, according to Ehrman, it was all lies. They made up these titles to prioritize their Gospels over all those other false ones that were out there. And so for critics like Ehrman, the external evidence is simply irrelevant. We just dismiss it. Instead, they think the internal evidence should be preeminent in a discussion like this. And so for critics, the internal evidence just doesn't give any clues as to who might be the author. As I said in the beginning of the video, the Gospels are formally anonymous. Mark never says in the body of the text, "I'm Mark. I'm writing based on Peter's eyewitness account." He doesn't say that. Yet it should be said, it's not really reasonable to assume that the author should include his name in the body of his text. People writing narratives especially don't typically do that sort of thing. Think about J.R.R. Tolkien, for example, and when you're reading The Lord of the Rings, you don't ever see his name show up in the body of the text. However, if you do want to see who wrote it, you should look at the cover or the title page. And so when we consider the internal evidence for the authorship, the first piece of evidence that we should consider is the title of the work itself. Now, in my English Bible, the title for the second gospel reads, "The Gospel According to Mark." Yet critics, like Ehrman, claim that that title is not original. Again, let me summarize for you Ehrman's views on the titles to the Gospels. He says, number one, the four Gospels were originally published with no titles. No titles at all. Number two, the four Gospels then circulated the Roman Empire without titles for almost a century. Number three, the church eventually gave titles to the Gospels to give them, quote, much needed authority. And number four, the authors were not eyewitnesses. But they were people who had heard the stories from others, who had heard the stories from others, who had heard the stories from others, and so on. Now, Ehrman makes some pretty bold claims here. But is he correct? Now, if Ehrman is correct, one should expect to find a whole bunch of anonymous manuscripts from the early centuries of the church. But guess what? Of all the gospel manuscripts that survive today, the ones that still have the cover on them, the flyleaf, or that still contain the first page, where at the top you might have the title and the author listed, or that still have the last page where the author might list their name. Of all the gospels where those pieces are still intact, guess how many of the gospel manuscripts are anonymous? 0. None of them. Not one. Now, P52, our earliest New Testament manuscript, only contains portions of John 18, and therefore it doesn't have a title because it doesn't contain the beginning or ending portions of the gospel. Obviously, fragmented manuscripts like this one don't have titles. But of all the manuscripts that still have their flyleaf, the beginning or the end, they still list the author, every single one. In other words, Ehrman makes the claim that the Gospels were written anonymously and circulated anonymously without any evidence. In fact, the evidence seems to point in the exact opposite direction, because not only are none of the Gospel manuscripts anonymous, they all have the same title. And guess who is listed as the author of the second Gospel every single time on these manuscripts? Mark. Now consider this list of the earliest surviving Markan manuscripts. Now, Mark was the least popular gospel in the early church, and so we don't have as many copies of it as we do for the other three. Yet, all the surviving manuscripts that we have either read Gospel according to Mark or simply according to Mark. Again, no hint of anonymity. Now, just think for a minute how unreasonable it is to assume that the four Gospels circulated anonymously and then were only given a title at a much later date. First, we need to consider how, without titles, it would have been very difficult for the church to know how to distinguish these works. Now, according to Clement and Justin Martyr, we know that churches had book cabinets or mini libraries that contained scriptural texts that they would use for liturgical purposes. We also know from Justin Martyr that the church, from a very early time, was reading from the Gospels while the church was gathered for corporate worship. So, how then would the church have announced the reading of these books if they didn't have any titles? Just imagine this for a second. Someone stands up Sunday morning and says, "Today's scripture reading is from this anonymous book in our collection." And then the congregation asks, "Well, which anonymous book?" To which the reader can only say, "Well, one of them." Because what else could he say if they're all anonymous? You see, for practical purposes, these books would have had to have had titles from the beginning, if for no other reason than to be able to identify those works and to be able to distinguish them from others. As Martin Hengel notes, the relevant information about each writing, its author, and its origin were kept in the Roman Church archive. This was important for reading them aloud in worship, since people had to know what they were reading there and also had to convey this to the community. Anonymous public readings were hardly tolerable, because each reading needed an authoritative or even inspired text and author. Now, a second reason this anonymous manuscript theory just doesn't work is because it would have been impossible for a person or even a group of people to go around the entire Roman Empire to places like Syria, Africa, Turkey, or France, round up all the manuscripts that were already in circulation, and then give them all the same exact titles. There's just no feasible way that that could have happened without leaving behind some trace of their original anonymity. We must remember that at this early time, there's no grand council or person that would have possessed the sort of authority to be able to round up all these biblical manuscripts and then give them all uniform titles. Again, at this point in time, councils and popes don't exist. Those came later. Again, here's Martin Hengel. It can therefore also by no means be assumed that at some time in this dark period, before Irenaeus, or even more before Justin, there had been a kind of general council of a number of churches in a province, at which the four hitherto anonymous writings gained recognition, were given their titles, and were then brought together as a four gospel canon. Such an idea would be completely anachronistic. Far less could the four gospel collection be the work of a single Christian author or school, because no person, school, or even community in the early second century possessed the authority and power to establish its own gospel collection throughout the church by one decisive action. Now, a third reason to reject this anonymous manuscript theory is the church simply had no motivation to attribute gospels to obscure characters like Mark and also Luke. If Ehrman is correct, and the church added these titles to give the Gospels, quote, much needed authority, couldn't they have done better than Mark? In fact, when we turn to the latter part of the second century and the beginning of the third century, we find that there's all kinds of apocryphal Gospels that are falsely attributed to eyewitnesses. There's the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary. All of these people were eyewitnesses to Jesus' ministry. They were either part of the 12 or they were a prominent follower like Mary Magdalene. These were titles that would give those works, quote, much needed authority. But Mark? I mean, there's no reason why the church would have attributed the gospel to him unless he really was the author. Just think about it, if the church were inventing authors, why wouldn't they just say the Gospel of Mark was the Gospel of Peter? The relative obscurity of Mark strongly supports the view that he is the author of this book. Now, who exactly is Mark? Well, there's really only one well-known Mark in the early church. He's mentioned in Acts, Paul's writings, as well as 1 Peter. We meet him first in Acts 12. After Peter had been rescued from prison by an angel, he came to a certain house. And we read in verse 12, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. There's just a few things to note here. First, Mark has two names, which was not entirely uncommon for Jews and in antiquity. John would have been his Jewish name, and Mark would have been his Greek name. Second, notice that the house belongs to Mary, which probably suggests that his father has since passed away. And third, notice that this house is in Jerusalem, and it's relatively large, since it's able to hold many Christians who were there praying. And what this probably means is that Mark came from a wealthy family. Now, next, we learn that Mark accompanied Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey. In Acts 12:25, we read, Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had completed their service, bringing with them John, whose other name was Mark. And after Paul and Barnabas had departed on their journey, we read in Acts 13:5, when they arrived at Salamis, they proclaimed the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews, and they had John to assist them. But then we read in verse 13, now Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John left them and returned to Jerusalem. So in short, Mark left Jerusalem to go back with Paul and Barnabas to Antioch. He then accompanied them on their first missionary journey and even served as their assistant. However, before they finished that journey, for some reason unknown to us, Mark left Paul and Barnabas and returned back home to Jerusalem. Now, we do know that Mark's departure caused a rift between Paul and Barnabas. And so as they prepared for their second journey, Barnabas wanted to take Mark along while Paul did not. And so they decided to split up. Barnabas did take Mark, while Paul went his way and took Silas. Now, in Paul's letter to Colossians, we learn something interesting that might explain why Barnabas was willing to give John Mark another chance. We read in Colossians 4, verse 10, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. Now, this text is interesting for a couple reasons. One, it tells us that Mark and Barnabas are related, which explains Barnabas's willingness to give Mark a second chance. It also helps explain Mark's Greek name, since we're told elsewhere that Barnabas is from Cyprus. It's likely then that John Mark's family was originally from the Greek-speaking region of Cyprus before they moved to Jerusalem. The text also indicates that Paul and Mark, somewhere along the line, were reconciled. And we'll see this more clearly in Paul's additional references to him. Another reference that Paul makes is in Philemon. Here, Paul writes, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends greetings to you, and so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. Now, if Paul is writing this from a Roman prison, which I think is likely, this confirms that Mark was in Rome in the early 60s, which is consistent with the tradition that Mark wrote his gospel from Rome. Another confirmation comes in Peter's writings. In 1 Peter 5, verse 13, Peter closes his letter by saying, She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son. Scholars are in agreement that Babylon refers to Rome in this verse. In other words, Rome was representative of what Babylon represented in the Old Testament times. It was seen as the preeminent worldly power opposing the people of God. And of course, at this time, Nero was the emperor of Rome, unleashing his fury against the Christians, persecuting them ruthlessly. Thus again, we have confirmation that Mark is in Rome in the early 60s. We also have a connection between Mark and Peter, in that Peter calls Mark his son. These details are all consistent with the external evidence that Mark wrote his gospel based on Peter's eyewitness testimony while in Rome. Now, that said, critics are still unconvinced that the gospel gives us any hint that Mark was its author. Now, notwithstanding the manuscript evidence that always lists Mark as the author, which is significant, they say one could never reach the conclusion that Mark was the author simply by reading the text itself. Now, I don't necessarily disagree with that. However, I think it's irrelevant. Again, if you're to read through Harry Potter, would you find any clues that J.K. Rowling was the author just by reading the text? Of course not. What you would need to do is read the cover or the title page to find out that information. Which again, all of our manuscripts list Mark as the author. This should be sufficient enough evidence with respect to the internal evidence. Nevertheless, I do think there are a few subtle clues in the text that appear to confirm the external evidence that Mark wrote this story, this gospel, based on Peter's eyewitness account. The first piece of evidence is that Peter is listed as both the first and the last disciple. Right? This is a literary device known as an inclusio, where the author brackets or bookends his work with similar material, so as to alert the reader about the intervening contents. Notice that the first mention of a disciple comes in Mark 1:16, which reads, Passing along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Now, this quote is interesting for two reasons. One, Simon is the first disciple mentioned. But two, notice the redundancy by which Mark uses Simon's name. He repeats it a second time when he says that Andrew is Simon's brother, when he could have just as easily said his brother, since he had already just mentioned Simon himself. It's as if he's repeating his name because he's wanting to tip off the readers about Peter's significance in this account. Then notice when we come to the end of the book, the angel tells the women to go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you into Galilee. Again, it appears as if Peter's name is used superfluously here. He could have just said, "Go tell the disciples," because of course Peter was one of them. But again, it looks like Mark is going out of his way to mention Peter so as to provide an inclusio. Simon Peter is mentioned at the beginning and the end as a subtle clue that he is the primary witness for everything that happens in between. Hengel writes, Mark forms an inclusio with Peter, which shows the unique importance of Peter to his work. Richard Bauckham agrees. He says Mark's reference to Peter in the penultimate verse of this gospel, pointing beyond the end of his own narrative, is designed to place Peter as prominently at the end of the story as at the beginning. The two references form an inclusio around the whole story, suggesting that Peter is the witness whose testimony includes the whole. A second subtle clue to Peter's involvement is the frequency by which he is mentioned in the book, as well as his presence throughout the entire narrative. Compared to the other synoptic gospels, Peter is mentioned far more frequently in Mark. In Matthew, Simon or Peter is mentioned once every 654 words. In Luke, it's once every 670 words. In Mark, Peter's mentioned once every 432 words. So you can see that Peter shows up at a much higher frequency in Mark than the other Gospels. Also, it's important to note that Peter is almost always present in the narrative. Between his initial call to discipleship in 116 through Jesus' trial, Peter is always present with only a few exceptions. The only places where Peter is not there is when John the Baptist is killed by Herod, for which none of the disciples were present for that. The time when John and James request to sit at Jesus' left and right hand in the kingdom, where only those two disciples are present. The brief description where the chief priests and scribes were conspiring on how to arrest Jesus, where none of the disciples are present. The scene where Judas promises to betray Jesus, where only Judas was present. And the trial scene where none of the disciples were present. Peter was outside, notoriously betraying Jesus 3 times. Otherwise, other than these exceptions, Peter is always present, and thus his eyewitness testimony is preeminent. The fact that Peter's name forms an inclusio around the narrative, and that his name is mentioned at such a high frequency, and that he is present in just about every section of this narrative, supports the idea that he is the gospel's primary witness. Now, one final subtle clue to consider is the unnamed young man who flees at Jesus' arrest. When Judas shows up with the guards at Gethsemane to arrest Jesus, this chaos breaks out, okay? This tussle breaks out. Peter takes out his sword, he lops off a guy's ear, presumably going for his head. But then we also read about this random guy who is not mentioned anywhere else in the story. Listen to what Mark writes in Mark 14, 51 to 52. And a young man followed him, with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Now, if you're reading this account, this reference to the naked streaker seems really bizarre. The person is not named and seems to be rather unimportant to the overall story. So why would Mark mention him? Well, we can't know for sure. But I think the best explanation is that the naked streaker is Mark himself. Just like a classic Alfred Hitchcock film where he would famously show up as a cameo in each of his movies, Mark is doing something similar here. Mark he's apparently spending the night out in this garden with Jesus and his disciples when these guards show up. And because he's sleeping, he's not wearing much clothing at the time. And so when they show up, this tussle breaks out. And as the guards go to grab him, he slips out of their grips, leaving behind what little clothes he had on. Now, I must confess, I find this story to be hilarious. And I certainly hope that it's true. That would be the ultimate cameo appearance. So in summary, the internal evidence appears to corroborate the external evidence. that Mark wrote this gospel based upon Peter's eyewitness testimony. All the surviving manuscripts list Mark as the author. Moreover, the inclusio of Peter's name, the frequency by which he is mentioned, and his presence throughout the entire narrative strongly suggests that he is the primary witness. So, in the end, despite the critics' contentions, I believe we still have compelling reason to affirm traditional authorship for Mark's gospel. In the next video, we're going to consider the authorship to the Gospel of Luke. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit like and subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments below.